Hey, what's going on, DDO players? Axel here. So today we're going to talk about Dark Apostate. Is it good? Is it bad? And then later on we'll go into the build I used for this character. So Dark Apostate, for those of you all who don't know, is one of the archetypes that were introduced this year into DDO. It is free to play, and this specific archetype is the one for the Cleric class, and it is a undead-themed Cleric. So I'll give you my thoughts, and I will tell you I did play this character as more of a melee-oriented Dark Apostate. Dark Apostate overall, it seems like the reception from the community has been that it's not that good. I don't think it's a great tree. It's okay. I think that it has some really unique advantages that may make it worth considering, even if it's not like super meta, and we'll go through those in a bit. I will say that the tree itself, though, it is fundamentally flawed in that the tree seems to be made from a design perspective for you to build a character that does both melee and offensive casting. And while I won't speak from the arcane side of things because I don't have enough experience running, say, like Eldritch Knight builds, I can say from a divine perspective, this is a bad idea. You don't want to build your character, in my opinion, you don't want to build your character to do both offensive casting and melee for essentially three different reasons. The first one, there's not enough feat slots to go around. Number two, there's not enough gear slots to go around. And number three is the opportunity cost. So we'll get into those right now. So this is not to say that you couldn't build a Dark Apostate that does both and that, say, takes feats for both. You certainly could do fine if you want to run, say, Elite or R1, but if you really want to push the difficulties, it's much better in DDO generally to be really good at one thing than to be just pretty good at two things. So when it comes to Divine specifically, issue number one is not enough gear slots. So if you're running as a melee, you need to slot multiple set bonuses: Deadly, Double Strike, Fort Bypass, Insightful Double Strike, Survivability stuff, multiple layers of defense, maybe DCs for tactics, deception. I mean, there's a lot of other things I could list, but the point is there are so many things in DDO that you need to slot, and the gear Tetris is still, despite them introducing things like Randall Lyric with additional augments, it's still pretty insane in DDO. All the different stacking effects, there's so many of them that it makes it so you are disincentivized from not being a specialist. You want to be a specialist in DDO when it comes to your DPS, because then you can maximize one type of DPS essentially, and you're just rewarded much more for that in DDO than being good at different types of DPS, at least when it comes to a melee. If you're running as a caster, you want to slot stuff like multiple caster set bonuses, spell DC gear, spell penetration, spell crit gear, multiple layers of spell crit gear that you can get specifically at endgame, caster filigree sets, spell point items, a lot of other things that I'm not listing as well. But you get the point. The point is there's too much stuff to slot in. The gear Tetris is too insane. You can't be good. You can't slot for two types of DPS, melee and casting, without giving up some of this stuff, because there's too much stuff to slot. So that's why it's better to be to do one thing versus wanting to do multiple things on your character when it comes to your DPS, melee versus offensive casting. Number two is the feat selection as well. There simply are not enough feat slots to go around for you to take everything you need in both melee and offensive casting. So if you're a melee Dark Apostate, for example, you're going to want to take two-handed fighting feat line. Let's just say two-handed fighting build. You're going to want to take two-handed fighting feat line, improved critical, precision, or power attack, overwhelming critical, a melee Scion feat at level 30, probably something like Scion of Vaporia, crush. You're going to take crush weakness, and then for your domain choice, you want to take War Domain, most likely. If you're an offensive caster Dark Apostate, you're going to want to take multiple Meta Magic, Spell Penetration, a level 30 caster feat, Wizard Past Life feat perhaps, a caster domain. So point is, not enough feat slots to go around. You can't, if you want to, you're better off just focusing on one or the other, in my opinion. So issue 3 is opportunity cost. This is a huge problem, I think, with Dark Apostate's design, because in order for this type of character to work, you need to have passive DPS, I think. Something akin to, say, like a Warlock aura, some kind of passive aura that does damage, and Dark Apostate doesn't have that. So DDO being a very Twitch game, being that it's very active with its combat system, there is a big opportunity cost for doing one thing versus another. This is not a role-playing game in terms of, this is not a turn-based game, is what I should be saying. It's a very Twitch-intensive game. So every second you are, say you're on a melee-oriented Dark Apostate, and you just do a lot more melee DPS than casting DPS. What this essentially means is every second you spend casting a spell is a second you're not spending hitting stuff with your weapon. And there's when the opportunity costs come in. So essentially, every time you cast a spell offensively with your Dark Apostate, when you're better at melee, you're losing DPS because you're not doing more DPS that you could be doing with your weapon. So there are certainly situations where, say, having both could be nice. So for example, if you have an enemy that's far away and you have some caster DPS, that certainly is nice. But those situations are not too common in DDO, and it's much, much better generally for you to do one thing really well rather than doing both just okay, just being okay or average at both. A lot of the Dark Apostate stuff is active stuff, so it really wants you to apply curses and cast stuff like prayer offensively. Fortunately, there's no no aura that could provide passive DPS. It might incentivize you a little bit more to build as a hybrid, because then you wouldn't have this opportunity cost to stand for, because you could still melee stuff and also do caster DPS at the same time with your aura. So now let's go through some highlights of the tree, both positive and negative. First of all, let's talk about being undead as a Dark Apostate. Is that good? Is that bad? I will say that, first of all, it's very cool looking, and I applaud SSG for the look of the character. I think Dark Apostate just cosmetically looks awesome, and it's one of the best things about running one. It's just how cool you look. I think there's certain situations where it could be advantageous to be undead, but I think overall, the negatives of being undead, no pun intended, outweigh the positives for Dark Apostate. So, if you're partying in a static group full of undead characters, this could be a really, really cool option, and it would be advantageous to be undead if, say, you're in a party with some Pale Masters, some Eldritch Knights, maybe another Dark Apostate, and you all could benefit from each other's healing. Maybe you could do you could cast a lot of inflict spells to heal the party, inflict mass. That could be really nice and helpful, but generally in DDO, the vast majority of the time, the healer in the party is going to be healing people with positive energy. You're going to be grouping in parties with people who are optimized for positive energy healing. So you're going to have to just rely on your own self-healing more. So I think that taking the 50% penalty, especially when you get to the higher Reaper skulls, can hurt quite a bit, because your healer just won't be able to heal you as well. Then again, if you have an awesome healer, it may not matter. However, this is not to say there are not unique advantages to Dark Apostate. So as an undead, you are of course immune to all kinds of nasty effects like energy drain, stun, exhaustion. So this is very, very convenient, and we'll get more into this later, the convenience factor of Dark Apostate. But perhaps the biggest advantage of Dark Apostate is its tier 5 ability called Benediction, which gives harm two times spell power scaling for harm. So your spell power times 2 is effective to your harm spells. So this makes your self-healing hilariously overtuned. Even without much gear, I was running around, because I didn't gear optimally for this life, because I was just running one Dark Apostate life. So I ran around with just one nullification item that had nullification and nullification lure on it, and I was comfortably self-healing in R6 through the Reaper self-healing penalty. And I would say that if you're, say, like on a caster Dark Apostate who really optimizes and really maxes out their negative energy spell power, you could maybe even self-heal comfortably in high skulls. So I will say that if you want a character with awesome self-healing, Dark Apostate certainly is worthy of consideration. You never have to worry about self-healing on this character. The other advantage Dark Apostate has is its imbue dice and toggle. You do get access to an imbue toggle, and you get more damage imbue dice as you move up in the tree. So this gives Dark Apostate a bit better DPS than, say, my normal melee cleric build that would not be getting these imbues and this extra imbue dice. So that's certainly an advantage. I will say Dark Apostate, of course, this goes without stating, but as a Dark Apostate, this is not a healer tree. So unless you're in an undead party, you're not going to be a healer, much of a healer. Certainly you could if you wanted to. You could say, be a healer through Epic Destinies by taking, say, stuff like the Angel Destiny, or maybe you take Renewal from Sentinel. You certainly could get by. You could still take Empower Healing and use positive. energy spell power, so you could still be a healer of sorts, but you won't have the full benefits of, say, the Radiant Servant tree, which Dark Apostate loses access to. So you're not really a healer as a Dark Apostate. Another big focus of the tree is Curse, both through the spell and as a melee weapon proc. You also get Prayer as an offensive spell, dealing double damage against opponents that are cursed. So Prayer turns into an offensive spell with Dark Apostate. I will say, as a melee, it's pretty fun running around cursing everything, especially if you're, say, using a weapon with a big crit range. So when I was leveling through epics, I was using the Drow Maul of the Weapon Master, which combined with the Silvanus deity feat was giving me a crit range of 14 to 20 on mauls. So it's pretty hilarious running around cursing everything on hits. But let's be honest, Curse is a very middling tier CC ability. Curse gives -4 to an enemy's to hit, skills, and saves. So practically all a Curse really does that matters is make CC slightly easier to land. So it could help out your party members in that department. But in reality, practically most players will have the DCs they need if they're geared for set abilities they're using for CC, or they wouldn't be using them in the first place. So it will make the difference sometimes, but usually not. The point of the Curse seems to be more that you use Prayer offensively for double damage. Even when cursed, Prayer wasn't anywhere close to being worth it over spending that time meleeing for my character. I would like to run Dark Apostate as an offensive caster to see how much damage you could build up with the Curse. I will say for what I was doing, it wasn't even close to being worth actually using Prayer. Since my character was more geared towards melee, I was doing way more damage in melee, so I didn't even bother messing around with this mechanic. But I would be interested to see how much damage you could build up from curses, from Prayer and curses, if you were actually geared this out as an offensive caster, which is not how I played the character. One last thing, even on a caster, Prayer has no range. It is centered on a caster. So I don't know how effective this would be or how practical, just because you wouldn't be able to take advantage of the most advantageous thing about playing a caster is being able to deal your damage from range. So I don't know how effective this would be on a caster and how practically on a caster would be worth using Prayer over, say, casting your Inflict or other negative spells. So let's now talk about the cores. The 2nd to 6th cores now give plus 5% incorporality and concealment each for a total of 25%. This, however, does not stack with gear, which is unfortunate because once you get to endgame, a lot of this stuff, especially the concealment, is pretty easy to gear for. Still, it's nice as a quality of life improvement. It's not very convenient, but it doesn't really do much for you if you're getting that bonus through your gear set anyways. But this brings me to my next point, which is what I referenced earlier with the convenience. Dark Apostate is a excellent choice for an extremely non-gear intensive character. If you are lazy and you don't want to gear out a character, Dark Apostate is something you could consider. Dark Apostate inherently gets not just concealment and incorporality, but also tons of stuff by being a cleric. Freedom of movement, true seeing, night shield. You get ghost touch in the Dark Apostate tree. You get protection of evil from being a cleric. You get 3 raises from being a cleric, tons of immunities from being undead, amazing self-healing, and probably a few other things I'm not mentioning. But point is, you get almost everything you need just inherently on this character. So if you're playing a fighter, for example, you've got to figure out, how do I fit in true seeing? How do I fit in concealment and corporality? How do I get a freedom movement clicky? But that's not something you have to consider with a Dark Apostate. The only things you really need to get are some things through UMD, like maybe greater heroism, like teleport scrolls, things like that. But for the most part, you're getting all the essential stuff inherently. So it's really nice, as it's kind of a lazy man's approach to a character. If you are lazy, this may be a class you'll enjoy playing. However, Dark Apostate still isn't a great tree with it being split between melee and caster enhancements. I've built mine as a melee and didn't find too many benefits here. There's no extra melee damage on cursed enemies, which really made the curse focus of the tree feel fairly irrelevant for me. You do get invulnerability on crits, however, which is nice for bosses as a tier 5 ability, but other than the extra damage dice, there's not much here for melee DPS, which is unfortunate. I really wish you did extra damage or had some kind of benefit as a melee from cursing enemies, but the only real benefit you get is Prayer, but I didn't want to use Prayer because I do way more damage through melee, so curse wasn't really doing a lot for me. There's not a lot of other melee stuff in the tree. There's no double strike, no strike through, nothing buffing crits, no active melee abilities, no trance. So tying back to my original criticism, this tree would have been so much better had it picked a street had it been focused on either melee or casting instead of trying to do both. I'd also add that I wish this tree had negative energy aura and negative energy burst in it so that it would mirror Radiant Servant. I think thematically that would be really cool and really fun. I would much rather, even if it's not as good, I would rather have negative energy aura and negative energy burst just because it would feel more cleric-y to me. It would feel like a mirror of the Radiant Servant tree where you do get Radiant Servant aura and Radiant Servant burst from the positive side of things. So that would have been really cool. And I think it would be more interesting than just giving us this like overtuned harm ability. It could have also given the tree a really neat role as an anti-caster cleric, like a negative energy healer to complement a party made up of undead. Granted, you can already serve pretty well as a undead party healer with your inflict spells and such, but it would have been really cool. Also, the burst and negative energy aura, if they would have included that, it would have better represented the turning ability of the tree, making it again feel more like a cleric tree. There's nothing in this tree really that incentivizes using turns. Turn undead just is not utilized very well in the tree. The only use of turn undead in the tree, assuming you're a non-charisma based non-turning build, is a tier 4 ability which gives some temporary HP, but it really feels lacking. Of course, casting Turn Undead, you still get the benefit from your domain because all domains have a 20-second proc on them, but still I felt like they should have tied more things into Turn Undead in this tree. Moving on now to other parts of the tree, there's 2 abilities in tier 4, Return to Dusk and Blessing of Shadow, which give 150 in cap range, and the other one gives displacement, invisibility, and some healing when unconscious, which are pretty interesting abilities. I think those are worth pointing out. They might be valuable in, say, hardcore especially, make it harder for you to die. I will say, though, this is not the type of Turn Undead utilization I was looking for. All right, let's get to the specific builds now, and I've got 3 builds I'm going to go over with you. Yes, if you've noticed, I've got a different shirt on. I'm using a different mic. I've recorded this part of the video several weeks after the first part, which is why. Anyways, let's get to the builds. I also will put a link below in the description to the video to the specific builds, but hear me out. Don't pause the video and just go there. I've got a bunch of stuff I need to talk to you about these builds. They are all two-handed fighting, melee-oriented Dark Apostates. So the first build I'm going to go over with you is completely free to play. The second build is a build that is almost free to play. It's a variant on the first one, and it's how I would play the character if I was starting at level 1. And then the third build is going to be what I actually played, which is a iconic Silvanus level 15 cleric, which level 15 iconic starting version of this, which is a variant of my normal melee cleric build. So let's get started with the completely free to play build. So when you're free to play, you're going to be strength based for these builds, and there's not a lot of options for two-handed fighting, and there's only one free to play. Well, there's staffs as well, but the best free to play two-handed fighting option is going to be Wood Elf. So Wood Elf using falchions as a favored weapon. You can get favored weapons with Wood Elf in the Wood Elf tree through the Faith of the Force enhancement. This build is going to be strength based. And the build, again, is a straight melee character. It's not an offensive caster. It's not a melee offensive caster hybrid. So just know that going in. It's also not a party healer unless you are in mostly a undead party, and then it could probably be all right in that role. So what this build does do is it has good melee DPS. It's not going to be super top tier meta, but it's good. It's going to be fine. You get a lot of imbued ice, a lot of extra DPS. The DPS is going to be better than like a typical melee cleric for sure that is not a Dark Apostate. But what else? This tree does also get awesome buffs, awesome support spells, good curse debuffs to help the party land, spells and CC, and some CC itself with stunning blow. And again, being a Dark Apostate, you're going to have amazing self-healing like we went over early in the video. So this build is going to be 18 Dark Apostate, 2 Fighter. 2 Fighter is for 2 extra feats, Haste Boost in Tier 1 Kensei, so you got to have Haste Boost, and as a free-to-play player, you're not going to have access to Vistani because you're free to play, but you can unlock it if you get Ravenloft later on. But for this build, since we are free to play, you got to have Haste Boost. Haste Boost is just too good to pass up in. So that's why we're splashing Fighter. Also going to Fighter because you get a second feat from the second Fighter level. You also get a +3 more Tactics DCs, and we're taking Stunning Blow on this build. So there's good reason to go to Kensei. There's not really any reason to go pure on a strength-based Dark Apostate. The capstone doesn't give much for you, so you're just much better going with a splash. But the starting stats are going to be 16 strength, 10 dex, 16 con, 6 int, 12 wisdom, 12 charisma. So you need a little bit of charisma because we'll use that for Divine Might. Divine Might in the War Priest tree is going to be Chaw-based Divine Might is going to be your Charisma-based Divine Might. That's going to be your Trance, so that's why you need a little bit of Charisma. It gives you some turns as well, but the turns aren't very good on this build. They're not that important. You need a little bit of Wisdom, which is why I took Wisdom, not just for will saves, but also for your minimum caster level. So as a Cleric, you do have to have 10 plus the level of the spell to cast it. So if it's a level 3 spell, you need to have 13 wisdom, so 10 plus 3 for the 3rd level spell. So that's why you need to take a little bit of wisdom. Wisdom shouldn't be a problem with starting with 12 wisdom, getting your minimum caster levels, actually cast your spells. But if it is a problem, you can get Owl's wisdom potions for cheap in the marketplace. Very, very cheap. You can buy those. And as you level this character, you want to just equip a wisdom item, the best wisdom item you can find, the highest value one you can find as you adventure, which won't be hard to find, as a free-to-play player, just finding random loot and chests. So you'll be fine, or you can go to the auction house, but it won't be, starting with 12 wisdom, you'll have plenty of wisdom, even without tomes. This also assumes no tomes, first life. So, but you'll be fine with 12 starting wisdom to be able to actually cast your spells. As you can see with the feats here, I do have Stunning Blow, which I am taking early here for some crowd control. Keep in mind your curse proc on your Dark Apostate as you get it later in the Dark Apostate tree does reduce saves by 4 when you apply curses on your weapon attacks, so that can help you land. You also can use, say, like Sunder to get an additional -3, so you could really debuff enemies to land your Stunning Blow if needed. And keep in mind you get extra tactics DCs in the Kensei tree, so you want to take that as you get it. The main things you want to take early are your falchions for favored weapons from the Wood Elf tree, and then haste boost from Kensei is probably the things you want to go for first. Let's see. There are some variations you could take for this build. So I have, in this build, I've laid it out so that you take the fighter levels early at 2 and 3, but you optionally could take the second fighter level last at level 20. It just depends on, would you rather get your cleric spells earlier, or would you rather get your extra feat earlier and that access to that tier 2 Kensei for the extra tactics DC. So that's your option, but you could, if you would like, you could take it at level 20 instead of level 3. You would definitely want to take your at least 1 fighter level early so you get access to haste boost and tier 1 Kensei. But yeah, that's a variation you could go with. Another option you could do is, instead of going 18 Dark Apostate to fighter, you could go 17 Dark Apostate, 2 fighter, 1 warlock, and then you could swap the feat I have here, Crush Weakness. You could swap that for Arcane Warrior and use the 1 warlock level to get Enlightened Spirit aura so that you proc Arcane Warrior. So Arcane Warrior, once you proc from an arcane spell like the Eldritch Aura, which does count as an arcane spell to proc it, you can stack up to an extra 20 melee power. It's a really popular thing right now, so that is an option, but I didn't do it in this build just because it is tactics, and instead of Arcane Warrior, you could take Crush Weakness for 15% extra helpless, and I wanted to keep it kind of simple and basic for newer players. And Arcane Warrior kind of depends on how you can build up the stacks, and that applies later, and I just thought it'd be easier and simpler. Keep it with 18-2, but keep in mind it is an option if you want to go 17-2-1. You also lose going 17. You'll lose, of course, the level 18 core in Dark Apostate. So be aware of that as well. Another thing to keep in mind is that you do need to be chaotic for this character. So I went with chaotic neutral. You could go with chaotic good. I went with chaotic neutral here, but you need to be at least chaotic. That way you get extra imbued eyes from the Harbinger of Chaos feat, which we're taking at level 31. It also means if you go tier 5 Fury of the Wild, you also get extra PRR and HP from one of the tier 5 enhancements in that tree. Okay, another thing I want to talk about here is a variant of this build, but I wanted to give a completely free-to-play version for just new players who might stumble upon this. But how I would play it from level 1 is I would go Warforged instead of Wood Elf. So Warforged, for those of y'all who don't know, it's the easiest thing to unlock in the game. Basically, it's 400 favor. So if you have Warforged unlocked and you're a newer player, I would go Warforged, but you certainly could go Wood Elf, and it'd be completely fine. It's just Wood Elf, you would use falchions. With Warforged, you're going to use Great Swords. So that's the main difference. Great Swords with Warforged, they get that as a favored weapon through Lord of Blades. Deity feat. Why Warforged? A couple reasons. The main reason being that there is a lot of good great swords in the game, particularly if this character, if you have great swords, if you have the Sword of Shadow, Epic Sword of Shadow, that would be a really nice weapon you can use as a favored weapon to level with. In addition, I personally like the Warforged tree a little better than the Wood Elf tree for this build. Wood Elf tree is good too, but the Warforged tree, you get extra strike through, extra DCs on your tactics, even more DCs. You get extra hit points, extra PRR, a lot of nice stuff in that tree. So I would go Warforged. Also, another thing to keep in mind about Warforged is that you don't have to worry about the normal healing penalty you would have on a construct, since we're going to be Dark Apostate, so we're going to be undead. So it doesn't matter that you're a construct, because you're going to be undead regardless whether you are Wood Elf or Warforged. You don't have to worry about the positive getting like any additional positive energy penalty on you. You'll have the same penalty whether you're Wood Elf or Warforged, because you'll be in an undead form regardless. Another thing to keep in mind is that you will lose a feat as Warforged, because you need to take adamantine body. So I've swapped this in here at level 3. So it's a minor loss. The last build I'm showing you here is a PDK Silvanus cleric, which this is a variant of my normal two-handed fighting melee cleric, and I'll put a link also below to that thread if you want to check out my normal two-handed fighting melee cleric. A couple things to keep in mind with this build: unlike the Warforged and Wood Elf build, this is Purple Dragonite. You have to be an iconic for this build. You want to either be Aasimar Scourge or Purple Dragonite. The reason is because only a few different Forgotten Realms races, so PDK, Aasimar Scourge, Deep Gnome, and Shatter Kai, those are the only races with access to the Silvanus deity feat. The Silvanus deity feat gives you +2 crit range with Mauls, so this will be and it gives you Mauls as a favored weapon, so you'll be using Mauls for this build, and you have to start at level 15 as an iconic unless you start and play this on the hardcore server. But keep in mind, the way I've organized the feats here, it wouldn't make sense if you're starting at level 1. I took some meta magics earlier than you would normally take if you were starting at level 1, just because that gives me more time for my tomes to kick in, so I can take less points into things I don't need, like strength, in order to take my two-handed fighting feats. That's the main reason I have these meta magics early. I wouldn't take them this early if I was leveling this character from level 1. But this character is different from the others because it is wisdom-based instead of strength-based. This uses the falconry tree for wisdom to hit and damage, and CCs, so you'll want to get like assassinate. You'll want to get assassinate gear on, because the falconry DCs, which falconry attacks in the tree, which do blind. There's one for CC and 2 single target variations of it in that tree, but they do not use tactics DCs. They use assassinate DCs plus your wisdom scores. So you'll want to make sure that you utilize those attacks when we get some assassinate DCs on this build. This is what I ran essentially, but keep in mind here, I did tilt this character to be able to heal a little bit, just because I raid every week, and I'm usually the primary healer, so I wanted to be able to throw some heals around. That's why I took more meta magics than I did in the previous builds I showed you with the Warforged or the Wood Elf. But you wouldn't if you don't want to, you don't have to take that. You can switch the feats around a little bit, but just keep in mind that's why I took some of these meta magics. And this build still is not really a party healer. It can do the job better than the previous builds, but just because of the extra meta magics, but it's still not really a party healer. The other difference with this build is I did take precision. Now the other builds I did take power attack, solely because the earlier builds are more heroics based, and to hit really isn't as much of a problem from my experience, until you get into epics and especially in-game legendaries. So this is more of an in-game focused build, whereas the other ones are more heroic leveling builds. Not that they wouldn't do fine in epics in in-game, they would, but that's why I took precision for better to hit at in-game. Also, a couple other things to keep in mind is that it makes more sense for this build to have the Dark Apostate capstone. You still could splash if you wanted. I just went ahead and went pure, because I normally go pure on my main two-handed fighting cleric, and I didn't want to use any hearts, but you certainly could splash if you wanted to, or if you run a Purple Dragonite. In particular is what you'd want to run if you don't want to use a +1 lesser heart from the store to remove any first iconic levels. But if you don't want to do that, I would just run Purple Dragonite, and you'll get the 1 fighter, which you can just keep the 1 fighter level, or just go 18 cleric 2 fighter like the previous builds. But if you don't want to worry about that, just make sure you go Purple Dragonite. If you want a deeper dive into Silvanus melee clerics, you can look at my regular two-handed fighting melee cleric build. Like I said, again, I'll put that below in the description. I'm not going to go through everything I did in that build. I also have a video, which I'll link below, going over the normal melee cleric build if you want to check that out as well. Also, for these builds, you can look in the threads for both Dark Apostate and the regular melee cleric build. Well, I'll give more detail, but I'm not going to go in this video over like heroic enhancements, epic destinies, all that stuff. But just check that thread. I'll add over time. I will add more information in that thread. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed. Let me know like what your experiences are with Dark Apostate if you have run one. I hope you found this video helpful. And hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. I'll see you next time. Take care.